बुद्धं शरणं गच्छामि धम्मं शरणं गच्छामि संघं
I intend to deliver a talk on the topic Buddhist religion and Indian culture. It shall be encompassing the following issues: emergence of Buddhism, different phases of Buddhism, spread of Buddhism, sources of Buddhism, Buddhism, whether it is a philosophy, psychology, religion or a way of life, teachings of Buddhism, that would be including Four Noble Truths and Noble Eightfold Path. Basic tenets of Buddhism, we shall be covering karma and rebirth. Then, three universal characteristics of Buddhism: impermanence, impersonality and wisdom. We shall also be discussing practice of Buddhism in the way of Arahat, Buddhist values and ethics, relevance of Buddhism, and then we shall be concluding with showing you the major sites of Buddhist temples and shrines in India. So far as emergence of Buddhism is concerned, it is believed that Buddhism arose on the northern border of India around 500 BC, and it was in the response to the Vedantic Hinduism of its day. Like all other medieval religions of the world, ancient Hinduism was a religion of rituals with an elite priesthood who administered a complex theology. It was also a period of intense intellectual and social ferment, during which the authority of Vedas had been placed in doubt. The concept of God as a supreme being and creator was in question, and hereditary restrictions on caste mobility were all under attack, and the efficacy of Brahminical rituals were being challenged. It also supported a society in which people were rigidly divided into a system of caste, role and power. However, the real cause still lies in the rise of Buddhism. It lies in the spread of new agricultural economy. Before these areas of northeastern India were colonized on large scale, they were densely forested and could not be easily cleared without the use of iron axes. Although some people lived in these areas prior to the 6th century BC, they used implements of bones, stones and copper, and they led a very precarious life on the banks of lakes and rivers and river confluences, where land was open to a settlement through the process of erosion and flooding. Here, the use of iron tools made it possible to clear, then make agricultural possibility and settlements. The agricultural economy based on the iron plowshare required use of bullocks and could not flourish without animal husbandry. However, the Vedic practice of killing cattle indiscriminately in sacrifices hampered the progress of new agriculture, and the cattle wealth was gradually decimated because the cows and bullocks were being killed in course of the numerous Vedic sacrifices, and non-Vedic tribal people living on southern and eastern fringes of Magad also killed cattle for the food. However, if the new agricultural economy was to stabilize, this killing has to be stopped, and it was around 500 BC we see rise of number of cities in northeastern India such as Kaushambi near Allahabad, Kushinagar, Varanasi, Vaishali, Chiran, Pataliputra, Rajgir, Champa and Bhagalpur. Both Gautam Buddha and Vardhaman Mahavir were associated with several of these cities, and artisans and traders working in them, they used coins for the first time, and they circulated these coins in the eastern part of UP and Bihar. Of course, the use of coins facilitated the trade and commerce, which added to the importance of Vaishyas. and we all know in the Brahminical societies, Vaishyas ranked third after the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas. Jainism and Buddhism at the initial stage did not attach any importance to the existing Varna system, and they preached the gospel of non-violence, which would put an end to the wars between different kingdoms and consequently promote the trade and the commerce. Moreover, the Brahminical law books called the Dharma Sutras, they also decried lending money on interest, and they condemned that those who lived on interest would be leading a bad life. Therefore, the Vaishyas who lent money because of the growing trade and commerce were held in the new esteem, and they looked for the better social status which was provided by Buddhism and under these emerging religions. Scholars assume the notion that Buddhist history is generally based on the understanding of Buddhist conception of time. Here we would like to discuss why do we study Buddhism and what is their concept of historicity. Buddhist conception of time is cyclic, not linear as the case of Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam and their other developments. For Buddhist, history definitely repeats itself over and again. In a linear conception of history, events occur only once. There is only one Moses, one Exodus, one Christ, one crucifixion and one Muhammad. The Indian conception of time, on the other hand, is cyclic, and Buddhists accept such a conception of history. There are many Buddhas, many have come and gone, and more will come in the future. We have lived many lives before and will continue to be reborn here and elsewhere in this vast cosmos. Buddhism has lived for 2500 years, and during this period it has undergone profound and radical changes. And if we follow Kahn's 500-year system, then we have 4 successive 500-year periods of Buddhist history, except for the last, it has been divided into 4 phases. The first period of Buddhist history is 500 BC to 0 BC, or this is called early Buddhism. It remained almost totally Indian, and it concentrated on the psychological questions. What are psychological questions? It is concerning individuals gaining control of their own minds and the analysis of method of self-control. During the second period, which is up to 500 AD, the Mahayana Buddhism spread outside India, especially in South and Southeast Asia and throughout Central Asia. And it was in turn significantly influenced by non-Indian thought. This second period focused on ontological questions, that is regarding being, that existence and reality, discussing the nature of true reality and realization of the true nature of things essential for enlightenment. The third period is 500 AD to 1000 AD. It is also called Tantra or Chan. It was a creative period of Buddhism when it spread to North and East Asia. This period was one of adaptation and Indianization, whereby Buddhism harmonized with ambient society and the cosmos in the quest for spiritual liberation. Secular powers tapped the religiosity of Buddhism in the quest for legitimation and worldly power. The fourth period, that is 1000 AD to 2000 AD, it is called modern Buddhism. And the last 100,000 years, we see at first decline of Buddhism in India and elsewhere. It went to the lowest ebb during the colonial period, and it was followed by the Buddhist revival in Asia and the globalization of. Let us talk about the spread of Buddhism. With about 365 million followers, 6% of world's population, Buddhism is the 4th largest religion in the world. It is exceeded in numbers only by Christianity, Islam and Hinduism. In the 3rd century BC, Indian Emperor Ashoka spread Buddhism by sending missionaries to Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand and other parts of Asia. Gradually, Buddhism has spread worldwide. Buddhism expanded across Asia, evolving into two or main forms. The first most form of Buddhism is Theravada Buddhism. It is sometimes called Southern Buddhism and occasionally it is also spelled Theravada. It has been the dominant school of Buddhism in most of Southeast Asia since the 13th century, and with the establishment of monarchies in Thailand, Burma, Cambodia and Laos. The second form is Mahayana Buddhism. It is sometimes called Northern Buddhism. It is largely found in China, Japan, Korea, Tibet and Mongolia. Then it is Vajrayana Buddhism or Tantric Buddhism or Mantrayan, Tantrayan or Esoteric Buddhism or True Words sects. Some consider this to be part of Mahayana Buddhism and others view it as a third Buddhist path. Then we have Tibetan Buddhism. This developed largely in isolation from Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism because of the remoteness of Tibet. Then we have Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism developed from within the Chinese Mahayana school known as Chan. Zen Buddhism is becoming increasingly popular even in the West today. Then we have modern Buddhism, which has emerged as a truly international movement. It started as an attempt to produce a single form of Buddhism without local accretions, and all Buddhists could embrace this Buddhism. Then how Buddhism spread to various parts of the world? It is spread by land, spread by sea. By land route, Buddhism is spread first into eastern Iran and Central Asia and then along the Karma route into China. Striking evidence showing that Buddhism early moved through the northwest passage out of India and is found in the Ashokan inscriptions in Greek and Aramaic found in Kandahar, which is now in Afghanistan. By sea route, Buddhism spread from the east coast in the middle of the first millennium to continental Southeast Asia and Indonesia. Some of the greatest Buddhist monuments, notably the Borobudur in Java and temples of Angkor in Kampuchea, are due to this seaborne expansion. The Buddhist missionaries also introduced important aspect of Indian culture, and that is notably writing using the Indian script to parts of Central Asia and most of the Southeast Asia. And then, what are the sources of Buddhism? For writing the history of Buddhism and for the study and understanding of this religion, Buddhist scriptures and other texts exist in great variety. Different schools of Buddhism place varying levels of value on learning the various texts. Some schools venerate certain texts as religious objects in themselves, while others take a more scholastic approach. Buddhist scriptures are written in Pali, Tibetan, Mongolian, Chinese, along with some texts that still exist in Sanskrit and Buddhist Sanskrit. Unlike many religions, Buddha has no one single central text, and over the years, various attempts have been made to synthesize a single Buddhist text that can encompass all major principles of Buddhism. In Theravada tradition, condensed study text was created that combined popular or influential scriptures into single volumes. Later, in Sri Lanka, the Dhammapada was championed as a unifying scripture. Dwight Goddard collected a sample of Buddhist scriptures which emphasized on Zen, and along with other classics of Eastern philosophy such as Tao Te Ching, into the Buddhist Bible in 1920s. And more recently in India, Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar attempted to create a single combined document of Buddhist principles in the Buddha and his Dhamma. Other such efforts have persisted to present day, but currently there is no single text that represents all the Buddhist traditions. We have Pali Tipitaka, which means 3 baskets, and it refers to 3 main Pitakas. One is Vinaya Pitaka, It contains disciplinary rules for the Buddhist monks and nuns, as well as explanations of why and how these rules were instituted, supporting material and doctrinal qualifications. Then we have Sutta Pitaka, which contains discourses ascribed to Gautam Buddha. Then we have Abhidhamma Pitaka, contains material often described as systematic exposition of the Gautam Buddha's teachings. One very important question here, whether Buddhism is a philosophy, it is a religion, it is a psychology, or it is a way of life. Here, it has been always a matter of concern and debate among the scholars. Those who regard Buddhism as a philosophy, they define Buddhism as a path that leads to moral life. Be mindful and aware of thoughts and actions and develops wisdom and understanding. And its teachings represent a complete and logical view. To others, it is not just a philosophy, because philosophy can explain things on a formal level of words and ideas, whereas Buddha's teachings and works were one's totality. While both philosophy and Buddhist practice lead to clarity of thought, only the latter can lead to permanent transformations, because it gives the practical key to inner and outer events which is experienced every day. Some people consider Buddhism to be a kind of psychology. They feel that teachings of Buddhism have the ability to transform those who practice them. Varying schools of psychology try to help people neither to be a burden on society nor to have too many personal difficulties. From the teachings develop a limitless courage, joy and love, which are mind's inherent wealth. Once the awareness of conditioned nature of all things grows, fixed concepts will fall away, and the perfect quality of body, speech and mind will naturally appear. The end result of practice, full enlightenment or Buddhahood, surpasses the intellectual and therapeutic goals of both philosophy and psychology. It is a state of perfection beyond concepts. Those who regard Buddhism a religion depends upon how they define religion. Census offices and public opinion posters generally include Buddhism as one of the world's major religions. Books that describe the religions of the world generally cover Buddhism along with Christianity, Hinduism and Islam. Even the Boy Scouts of America, who root out and expel atheists and agnostics, accept Buddhists as members. The government of Canada denies registration of religious charities unless they teach the belief in one or more gods or goddesses. However, they allow Buddhist faiths groups to register. People have followed Buddhist religion based on the teachings of a man that they call Buddha, meaning the enlightened one. Buddhism as a religion does not require a person to accept fixed beliefs and ideas, and does not concern it by debating whether or not it is a religion or a god. It regards all such beliefs as secondary importance and believes that its prime objective is to help people overcome suffering and to achieve a full life. Goal of Buddhist religion is therefore enlightenment, which means to be fully awakened to the reality of life, to have an understanding of why there is suffering in the world and how it may be overcome. The starting point in Buddhism is mankind and the way in which they suffer not just physical pain but the general feeling of dissatisfaction with life, craving to achieve or have something more, fear of change and death. It seeks to give a person peace of mind and to encourage and develop loving compassion toward all living beings. Buddhists claim that in the teaching of Buddha, they find a path which will eventually lead them to achieve this enlightenment for themselves, and the basis to all Buddhism expressed in what they call triple jewels, that is three ratna, and they call Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami and Sangham Sharanam Gacchami. That is the enlightened one, Buddha, the Dhamma, the teachings, and Sangha, the community of monks. To define Buddhism as a religion, philosophy or way of life thus depends upon how you look at it. As a moral teaching, it excels all other ethical systems, but morality is only the beginning and not an ending of Buddhism. In one sense, Buddhism is not a philosophy. In other sense, it is the philosophy of philosophies. In one sense, Buddhism is not a religion. In other sense, it is the religion of religions. Buddhism is thus neither a metaphysical path nor a ritualistic path. It is neither skeptical nor dogmatic. It is neither self-mortification nor self-indulgence. It is neither pessimism nor optimism. It is neither eternalism nor nihilism. It is neither absolutely this worldly nor otherworldly. It is a unique path of enlightenment. The original Pali term for Buddha is Dhamma, which literally means and that which upholds. There is no English equivalent that exactly conveys the meaning of this Pali term Dhamma. The Dhamma is that which really is. It is the doctrine of reality. It is a means of deliverance from suffering and deliverance itself. Whether the Buddhas arise or not, Dhamma exists. The Buddha taught many things, and when we see the teachings of Buddha, we see the basic concepts in Buddhism. They can be summed up by 4 noble truths and noble eightfold path, which we all perhaps have heard about it, and now we shall be talking at length about these teachings. Because the Buddha deals with the most universal of all human problems, the problem of suffering. He made his teachings a universal message addressed to all human beings solely by reason of their humanity. In his first sermon, which he gave to his 5 ascetics in Deer Park near Varanasi, the Buddha spoke of the 4 noble truths. And 4 noble truths are the central teaching of the Buddha. These are the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the end of suffering, and truth of path leading to end of suffering. What is truth of suffering? This is the first of the 4 noble truths. Buddha's discovery of the solution to the problem of suffering began with the recognition that life is suffering. Suffering may be physical or mental. It can be experienced by everyone and anywhere in the world around us. What is physical suffering? Physical suffering may be seen in many forms. People must have observed, all of us must have observed in one time or the other of our life that how our aged relatives suffer. Most of the aged suffer aches and pains in their joints. Very simple, and many find it hard to move about them, how to go about them. With advancing age, the elderly find life difficult because they cannot see, hear or eat properly. The pain of disease which strikes young and old alike is unbearable, and the pain of death brings much grief and suffering. The truth is that suffering of birth, old age, sickness and death is unavoidable. Some fortunate people may now be enjoying relatively happy and carefree life, but it is only a matter of time before them too will experience suffering sometime. What is worse, this suffering must be borne alone. And besides physical suffering, we have mental suffering also. We also experience various forms of mental suffering. Feeling of sadness, feeling of loneliness or depression. It is inherently experienced when we lose someone we love through separation or death. We feel irritated or uncomfortable when forced to be in company of those whom we dislike or those who we feel are unpleasant. People who suffer when they are unable to satisfy their limitless needs and wants. And yes, of course, there is a happiness in life also. When Buddha said there is suffering in life, he did not deny that there is happiness also. On the contrary, he spoke of many kinds of happiness, such as the happiness of friendship, happiness of family life, and so on and so forth. But all these kinds of happiness are impermanent, and when one loses them, one suffers. For example, one may like a very pleasant and charming person and enjoy his or her company. But when one is separated from that person, the happiness turns into suffering. One suffers because of one's attachment to pleasures that do not last. People often remain unaware of the inevitable suffering of life because they are distracted by the temporary pleasures. What is the truth of the cause of suffering? Buddha observed that life is a suffering. Before he could find a solution to the problem of suffering in life, he looked for the cause of suffering. And Buddha, just like a good doctor, first observes a patient's symptoms and then identifies the cause of illness before prescribing a medicine or a cure. Buddha discovered that direct cause of suffering are desire or craving and ignorance. This is the truth of the cause of suffering, which is the second noble truth. What is craving? Craving is the deep-seated desire that all living beings have for the pleasure of senses and for life itself. For instance, people always seek to enjoy good food, entertainment and pleasant company. Yet, none of these can give them complete and lasting satisfaction. After the fine meal has been eaten and served, beautiful music heard and the pleasant company shared, one is still not content. One would like to enjoy these pleasures again and again and as long as possible. When we have obtained something that we desire, we may want more and more of it, and so greed arises. Because of desire and greed, people will lie, cheat and steal to get whatever they want. Uncontrolled desires can also lead to addiction. For example, smoking, drinking and overeating. All of this lead to suffering and cause mental and physical harm. Desire, when obstructed, can lead to ill will and anger. This is in turn can lead to harsh words, violent quarrel and even fight or killing. What is this? This is all suffering. And ignorance. Craving or desire is like a great tree having many branches. There are branches of greed, branches of ill will and of anger. Fruit of this tree is suffering. But how does the tree of craving arise? Where does it grow? The answer is that the tree of craving is rooted in ignorance. It grows out of ignorance. Ignorance is the inability to see the truth of things, to see things as they really are. There are many truths about the world which people are ignorant of because of limitless of their understanding. When people develop their minds and acquire wisdom through study, careful thought and meditation, they will see the truth. They will see things as they really are. They will understand the suffering and impermanence of life, the law of cause and effect, and the Four Noble Truths. By overcoming craving and ignorance, they will attain happiness and enlightenment, just as Buddha did about 2500 years ago. What is the truth of end of suffering? Buddha's realization of the end of suffering and his attainment of nirvana at the age of 35 crowned his search for truth with success. For 6 years, the Bodhisattva had spared no effort to find a solution to the problem of suffering. He had tried the principal method of ending suffering and had found them incomplete. Eventually, he found his own solutions to the problem of life. Confidence in Buddha's teaching is one thing must we all have. Having realized the truth, through his own efforts, Buddha offered it to all and were ready to listen. He taught his disciples through narration of his own experiences about the search for truth. An old story of a turtle and a fish can explain the reason to have confidence in Buddha's teachings. The turtle lived on land as well as on the water, while the fish only lives in water. One day, when turtle had returned from visit to the land, he told the fish of his experiences. He explained that creature walked rather than swam. The fish refused to believe that anything like land existed, because it was something beyond his own experience. In the same way, people may not have experienced the end of suffering, but it does not mean that end of suffering is not possible. A patient must have confidence in an experienced doctor, otherwise he will never take a medicine that the doctor has prescribed and that will not be cured of his sickness. Similarly, people must have confidence in the teaching of Buddha, who has shown the end of suffering is really possible. The end of suffering is the final, thus goal of Buddha's teaching. It can be experienced by anyone, by everyone, here and now. For example, when greed and anger arise in one's own mind, one experiences unhappiness. And when thoughts of greed and anger cease, one's mind becomes happy and peaceful. To end suffering completely, one must remove desire, ill will and ignorance. This is the third noble. By putting the Buddha's teaching into practice, people can also achieve supreme enlightenment. Enlightenment has countless qualities, of which perfect wisdom and great compassion are the most important. With perfect wisdom and great compassion, we are able to help countless beings to overcome their sufferings. Experiencing nirvana for oneself, and the end of suffering has been described as supreme happiness and enlightenment. However, these terms do not fully express the real nature of end of suffering or nirvana. Nirvana cannot be exactly put into words. Attempting to describe nirvana is just like saying that a mango is sweet, but not like a banana or apple. One has to eat a mango in order to know oneself and is really taste. How it really tastes would be told only when we really eat it. Similarly, nirvana has to be experienced. If people have confidence in the Buddha's teachings and put them into practice, they can achieve happiness, peace and enlightenment. The truth of the path leading to the end of suffering is middle path. As a youth, Prince Siddhartha enjoyed an indulgent life of pleasure in his father's palace. Later, when he renounced the worldly life and became an ascetic, he experienced the hardship of torturing his mind and body. Finally, not long before attaining enlightenment, he realized fruitlessness of these two extreme ways of life. He realized that the way to happiness and enlightenment was to lead a life that avoided these two extremes. He describes this life as a middle path. These three ways of life have been compared with the three settings or strings of different tensions on a lute. We have on lute loose string, tight string and the middle string. The loose string, which is like a life of indulgence, produces a poor sound when struck. The tightest string, which is like a life of extreme asceticism, similarly produces a very poor sound when struck and is also likely to break at any moment. Only the middle string, which is neither too loose nor too tight, produces a pleasant and harmonious sound when struck. The middle path likewise has a middle string, is the best to choose for Buddha. And so, those who follow the middle path and avoid the extremes of indulging in one's desires and the opposite extreme of unreasonably torturing one's body and mind will find happiness, peace of mind and enlightenment. And this is the fourth noble truth of the path leading to the end of suffering. Buddha, like a doctor, recognized the sickness of the suffering. He identifies its causes and discovered its cure and put his discovery into a systematic formula which can be easily followed in order to end our suffering. And the formula includes both physical and mental treatment, and it is called a Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path, which was discovered by Buddha himself, is the only way to nirvana. It avoids the extremes of self-torture that weakens one's intellect and extreme of self-indulgence that retards one's spiritual progress. What are these eightfold noble paths? This is right vision, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. What is right vision? Right vision is the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. In other words, it is the understanding of oneself as one really is. The keynote of Buddhism is thus right vision. Buddhism, as much as based on the knowledge and not on the unreasonable belief. What is right thought? Right thought are threefold. The thought of renunciation, which are opposed to sense pleasures, kind thoughts, which are opposed to ill will, thoughts of harmlessness, which are opposed to cruelty, and these tend to purify the mind. Right speech deals with refraining from falsehood, stealing, slandering, and harsh words and frivolous talks. Right action deals with refraining from killing, stealing, and unchastity. It helps one to develop a character that is self-controlled and mindful to right of others. Right livelihood deals with 5 kinds of traits which should be avoided by lay disciples. These are trade in deadly weapons, trade in animals for slaughter, in slavery, trade in intoxicants, in poisons, and right livelihood means earning one's living in a way that is not harmful to others. Right effort deals with the endeavor to discard evil that has already arisen, the endeavor to prevent the rising of unrisen evil, the endeavor to develop that good which has already arisen, and the endeavor to promote that good which has not already arisen. Effort is needed to cultivate good conduct and develop one's mind, because one is often distracted or tempted to take the easy way out of things. Buddha teaches that attaining happiness and enlightenment depends upon one's own effort. Effort is the root of all achievement. If one wants to get on the top of the mountain, just sitting at the foot thinking about it will not bring one there. It is by making an effort of climbing the mountain step by step that one eventually reaches the summit. Thus, no matter how great the Buddha's achievements may be or how excellent his teaching is, one must put the teaching into practice before one can expect to obtain the desired way. Right mindfulness is with regard to body, with regard to feeling, and with regard to mind, and with regard to the mental objects. In other words, right mindfulness is the awareness of one's deeds, words, and thoughts. Right meditation means the gradual process of training the mind to focus on the single object and to remain fixed upon the object without wavering. The constant practice of meditation helps one to develop a calm and concentrated mind to help to prepare one for the attainment of wisdom and enlightenment ultimately. Karma, Buddhism and Buddha does explain about what are the good karma, what are the bad karma. The karma or action, and Buddha has explained why people differ in their circumstances and why some are more fortunate in life than the others. Buddha taught that one's present condition, whether of happiness or suffering, is the result of accumulated force of all past actions or karma. Karma is intentional action, that is deed done deliberately through body, speech or mind. Karma means good or bad volition, kushal or akushal karma. In other words, karma is the law of moral causation. It is action and reaction in the ethical realm. It is natural law that every action produces a certain effect. So, if one performs wholesome actions such as donating money to charitable organizations, one will experience happiness. On the other hand, if one performs unlawful actions such as killing a living being, one will experience suffering. This is the law of cause and effect at work. In this way, the effect of one's past karma determines the nature of one's present situation in life. So, there are 2 kinds of karmas, wholesome karma and unwholesome karma according to Buddha. Actions are considered wholesome if they produce happiness for oneself and the others, and unwholesome if they produce suffering. There are 10 unwholesome actions which need to be avoided if one wishes to be happy. And what are these unwholesome actions? They are killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, telling lies, tale-bearing, harsh speech, idle talk, greed, anger and wrong views. And what are alternatively the 10 wholesome actions that one ought to strive to perform? They are charity, self-restraint, meditation, reverence, service, transfer of merit, rejoicing in others' merit, hearing the Dhamma, teaching the Dhamma, state one's views. And then there are short-term karmas and then there are long-term karmas according to Buddha. The effect of an action done in this life can be experienced within this lifetime, and this is called a short-term karma. In some cases, actions do not produce their effect in this lifetime. The effects are felt in the future lives. Similarly, actions done in past lives may produce effects in this life. Buddha and his prominent disciples were able to see the future effects of karma through their own extraordinary understanding. If a person acts wisely by performing wholesome actions, he will experience happiness in this life as well as in the future lives, of course. If he acts foolishly by performing unwholesome actions, his unwholesome karma will result in suffering in this life and in future lives. And there are also some neutral actions. What are these neutral actions? The law of karma does not apply to actions such as walking, sitting or sleeping. Such actions do not produce effects apart from actions themselves. Similarly, accidentally killing an insect is considered a neutral action because it is unintentional. There was once a blind monk who would, while walking about, accidentally steps on the ant, thereby killing them. When his fellow monks noticed this, they reported to Buddha, who pointed out that as a blind monk's killing of the ant was unintentional, it was neither wholesome nor unwholesome karma, and therefore there will be no corresponding effect would arise. How to determine one's own destiny? According to Buddha, the law of karma is natural law of cause and effect. Intentional actions will at some time produce their effects. People in their present lives are experiencing the effects of their past actions or karma. However, it is possible to alter or reduce the effects of these actions through counteraction. By their present action, people can produce new karma and with short-term and long-term effects. These new karma will determine their situation in future lives. Thus, understanding law of karma helps one realize that people are whatever they make themselves to be. They are entirely responsible for their own destiny. Then one question that is often asked, what is happening to us in this life and what will happen to us after death? According to Buddhists, rebirth takes place at the end of this life. Buddhists regard rebirth as a fact. This is evidence that each person has lived many lives in the past and will continue to live many more lives in the future. And rebirth is the reality, although one may not be aware of it. The existence of past lives has been confirmed by those who have developed their minds through the meditation. Buddha, on the night of his own enlightenment, developed an ability to see his past lives. He saw being dying in one state of existence and being reborn in another, according to their own actions. It was from personal experience that the Buddha taught his followers the truth of rebirth. And this rebirth, he suggested, happens in 6 realms. Buddha teaches that birth, death and rebirth are the part of continuing process of change. This is similar to the continuous process of growth, decay and replacement of cells in one's own body. At the moment of death, when his life is over and the body can no longer survive, the mind is separated from the body, and at that time the craving for life causes one to seek a new existence, and the karma done previously determines the place of one's rebirth. And there are, according to Buddha, 3 realms in which one may be reborn after death. First is realm of gods, second is demigods, third is human beings, fourth is animals, fifth is hungry ghosts, and sixth is the hell. And these 6 realms of existence include 3 relatively happy states and 3 relatively miserable states. The realm of gods, the demigods and human beings are considered more happiness and they get less suffering. The realms of animals, hungry ghosts and the hells are of course considered relatively miserable because their lives and their living being there suffer more from fear, hunger, thirst and pain. Of all the 6 realms, the realm of human being is considered most desirable. In the realm of human beings, the conditions for attaining nirvana are better. Then he talks about the cycle of birth and death. Because of the force of their karma, people are born and reborn endlessly in one realm of existence or in another. Buddha declared that there is no permanent rest in this cycle of birth and death. It is only when one follows the Noble Eightfold Path taught by Buddha and eventually attain nirvana that one finally becomes free from these ceaseless cycles and gains supreme and permanent happiness. Then it depends upon the origination. And according to Buddha, all things arise from causes and conditions. Like a sprout, for example, arises from a seed, but it depends on the soil, moisture, air, sunlight for its growth. In any of these conditions, if it is missing, then the sprout will not grow. In the same way, life arises from the cause and conditions and not through the mere chance. A man becomes a father of his relation to his son. Emptiness does not mean nothingness. On the contrary, it means openness and infinite possibility. Any son can become father if the right combination of causes and conditions is present. Similarly, anyone can become enlightened if he cultivates good conduct, mental development and wisdom. That is Eightfold Path. Then there are 3 universal characteristics which Buddhism has given us. And these are impermanence. So these are 3 universal characteristics of Buddhism. Impermanence. Buddha taught that all existence is impermanent because there is nothing internal or external whatsoever which is permanent, stable, lasting, not subject to decay or destruction, and forever the same. Everything changes continuously. Our body, for instance, is made up of material elements like flesh, bones and blood which are impermanent. From the moment of our birth, the body constantly undergoes change. The human mind too is dependent on many factors, so it is in constant change also. Neither the body nor the mind is permanent and unchanging. Understanding the characteristics of impermanence benefits people in 2 ways. Firstly, it can improve human relationships and activities. Secondly, it can encourage the people to follow the Noble Eightfold Path. Often people find that they make mistakes in their relationships with others because they fail to take into account the changes that are constantly occurring in themselves and others. Often friendship dies because one or both parties fail to understand and realize that their friend's personality, their interests and their attitudes have changed. So they just forget how to explain this and relations decay. Then there is a dependent origination and relativity. Having understood that youth, health, material well-being and even life itself are impermanent, people should then make the most of these favorable circumstances while they last. This means that they need to practice the Noble Eightfold Path in order to achieve happiness and enlightenment. Buddha's last words were, "Subject to change are all things. Strive on with diligence." Suffering. The truth of suffering is the first of the 4 noble truths taught by Buddha. Suffering is a fact of life which people can see for themselves. It is one of the 3 characteristics of existence itself. Whatever is impermanent is also suffering. Everything which arises will last only for a very little time. Since people tend to cling to youth, health, relationship and material achievements, the realization that these are impermanent cause anxiety and fear. Impersonality. People often think that there must be a personality or self that is real and permanent. Otherwise, they would not exist or experience things in life. However, Buddha taught that there is no real, permanent and independent personality or self at all. Impermanence, suffering and impersonality. These are the three existence characteristics of Buddhism. What is impermanent is suffering, and whatever is impermanent and suffering is also without an independent self. Those who realize the truth of these three facts of existence will be able to overcome suffering because their minds are freed from the delusion of permanence, pleasure and the self. According to Buddha, how this can be achieved, and this can be achieved according to him, is through Arahat, that is the perfected one. Arahat, who has overcome the impurities of desire, ill will and ignorance. In other words, Arahat is finally freed from suffering of existence in the cycles of birth and death, and he attains nirvana. When a person realizes that there is no lasting happiness and freedom, whenever he may be reborn within the cycles of birth and death, he will strive to attain a goal of nirvana. The way of the Arahat is thus the path leading to this goal. The Arahat attains the goal of nirvana by following strictly to three ways of practice. And what are these three ways of practice? Good conduct, mental development and wisdom. What is good conduct according to him? It is purification of body, speech and mind. Arahat achieves perfect purity of all the three types of actions of body, speech and mind by strict observance to 5 precepts of Buddhists. What are the 5 precepts? They are avoiding killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, telling lies and taking of intoxicants. And also by avoiding 10 unwholesome actions which we have already discussed, that is killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, telling lies, tale-bearing, harsh speech, idle talk, greed, anger and wrong views. And practicing mindfulness and meditation according to Arahat, there are various methods, and with these methods can lead Arahat gradually discipline and control his mind so that it remains calm, undistracted and aware. Two of the best known methods are mindfulness of the body and mindfulness of the process of breathing. A person who practices mindfulness of the body cultivates awareness of his bodily actions and postures. When he is walking, for example, he is aware of the fact that he is walking. When sitting, he is aware that he is sitting. Similarly, he is aware when he is lying down, standing or doing any other actions. When a person becomes angry, nervous or upset, his breathing tends to quicken. At such times, if he makes a conscious effort to breathe deeply and slowly, he will usually find that his mind becomes calmer and the body becomes relaxed. Thus, a commonly used form of Buddhist meditation is the practice of mindfulness of breathing. Then there is also developing insight, that is wisdom. The purpose of meditation is to develop the power of concentration. Like a sharpened knife that can cut easily through these solid objects, and concentrated mind is able to see things as they really are. At that point, the meditator gains insight into the three characteristics of existence. He understands perfectly that all things are impermanent, involves in suffering and they are impersonal. For the first time, he gets the glimpse of nirvana and is on the threshold of becoming an Arahat. Then it leads to the way of the Bodhisattva. And the goal of Buddhist practice is to really achieve supreme happiness and freedom from suffering. A person motivated by compassion will decide to attain this goal not only for him but for all other sentients and other beings as well. When he has this wish, it means that he has awakened and thought of enlightenment he has become a Bodhisattva. He has started on the path that will ultimately lead him to the supreme and perfect enlightenment of a Buddha. Buddhism saw the root of all human sufferings in ignorance, and that could be ended through the acquisition of wisdom. rather than expect some supernatural entity to end the human suffering. The Buddhists argued that it was in human hands to end their own sorrows through conduct and action driven by knowledge and correct understanding of human nature and the physical world. Hence, the aspiration for knowledge, that is jigyasa, was seen as an answer to the blind faith. And central to the Buddhist philosophy was understanding of human nature and what caused human suffering, that is dukkha. They saw human personality as constituting of 5 attributes, that is feeling, body, perception, disposition and consciousness, and used this framework to develop their understanding of human suffering. For addressing suffering, Buddhists advocated a 4-fold scheme of recognizing the problem, that is suffering, identify cause of suffering, that is craving stemming from ignorance, then establishing the goal of ending the problem, that is nirodha, that is cessation of suffering, nirvana, and then lastly conducting life in a manner that was consistent with the cessation of suffering, following the right path or engaging in the right practice or mark. And unlike religions that were based on revealed truth or the sanctity of every word in a holy textbook, Buddhist belief system prescribed reasoning based on investigation as a means of determining one's dharma or dharma as in the Hindu practice. Thus, even as Buddhism has spread almost throughout Asia, by the 5th and 6th century AD, it gradually began to lose its distinct edge and liberating influences on many Indian societies. Within the Indian subcontinent, strains of Buddhism survived in Sri Lanka, Bengal, Bhutan, Sikkim, parts of Bihar, Nepal and parts of Sindh, Punjab, Kashmir and of course Afghanistan. And we have vast literature of Buddhism, like much of Hindu and Jain literature. It was not a literature of revelation or authority, rather its essays on social ethics and moral responsibilities. It treatises on philosophy and science. Its art and poetry were pointless to path of wisdom. This gave Buddhism both flexibility and adaptability. And owing to its non-hegemonic character and humanist approach, Buddhism was adopted without coercion or force. It was also successfully fused with Hinduism in many parts of Southeast Asia. In China, it was integrated with Taoism and Confucian philosophy. And in Japan, it was related to the Shinto beliefs. The catastrophic demise of Buddhism in India, sadly, was triggered off by the onslaught of Islam and first obliterated the remains of Buddhism in Central Asia and then later in Afghanistan and India. By and large, Buddhism survived only in those countries that escaped invasion by the Buddhist Islamic conquerors. Accustomed to centuries of peaceful coexistence, India's Buddhists had not anticipated the need to develop a viable strategies for self-defense and that could have combated the violence of India's Islamic conquerors that virtually obliterated Buddhism from the land of its origin and birth. Here, we must acknowledge that ascent of Islam was concomitant with the eclipse of Buddhism, and since the influence of Buddhism was greatly dependent on the existence of monastic orders, and we all know that destruction of monasteries and their conversion to mosques and institutions of Quranic learning simply led to the mass conversion to Islam. And although the sacking of monasteries and centers of learning such as Nalanda and Vikramshila in Bihar led to records of the original Buddhist texts being permanently destroyed, it has been possible to reconstruct some of them from the translations that survived outside India, such as in Thailand and Tibet. Notwithstanding the virtual erasure of Buddhism in India, it is possible still to infer and conclude from these reconstructed texts that other archaeological records and surviving monuments and artifacts that Buddhism had a very, very powerful impact in shaping the destiny of India and in triggering a social and cultural renaissance that would take Indian and other Asian civilizations to a higher level of social, cultural and material development. In the mid 20th century, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was one of the architects of our India's constitution, gave Buddhism a fresh lease of life by embracing it in a few years after India achieved independence. A significant number of members to those castes who were denied equal rights in the Hindu caste hierarchy, they all embraced Buddhism. Today, an overwhelming proportion of Buddhists in India are these recent converts who term themselves as Nava-Buddha or New. So, we can conclude here that in this talk, I have tried to conclude and discuss the emergence of Buddhism, its different phases, how Buddhism spread, what are the sources of Buddhism, whether it is a philosophy, psychology, religion, and or a way of life. What are the teachings of Buddhism, its Four Noble Truths and Noble Eightfold Path, basic tenets of Buddhism, karma and rebirth, and then its universal characteristics, and then how to practice Buddhism, Buddhist values and ethics, then of course its relevance for today's century. Now we shall be seeing the principal Buddhist pilgrimage sites and also the shrines which are primarily located in the Ganges Valley of India, and some of the Buddhist temples of India which are an attraction to the pilgrims and the Buddhist monks and the Buddhist disciples all together. We shall be seeing first of all Bodh Gaya in Bihar. Bodh Gaya is where Prince Gautam attained enlightenment under the sacred Asvattha tree, that is Bodhi tree, and became known as Lord Buddha. This is one of the four most sacred. This is Kaushambi in Uttar Pradesh. Kaushambi was visited by Buddha in the 6th and 9th years after his enlightenment. He delivered several sermons here, elevating it to the center of learning for Buddhists. Today we can see the ruins of an Ashokan pillar, an old fort, and Ghausitaram monastery. Kushinagar, Uttar Pradesh. Kushinagar in Uttar Pradesh is one of the principal centers of Buddhist pilgrimage, and it is a place of Mahaparinirvan. The monument of Kushinagar are situated in 3 districts comprising in the main site of Nirvana temple, houses over 6-meter long statue of the reclining Buddha. The image was unearthed during the excavations in 1876. It is situated in the North Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, 51. Now we are showing you Lumbini, which is in Nepal, India's border. Lumbini, a place in the southwestern Tarai of Nepal, it evokes a kind of holy sentiment to the millions of Buddhists all over the world, as do the Jerusalem to Christians and Makkah to Muslims. Lumbini is the place Lord Buddha, the apostle of peace and light of Asia, was born in 623 BC. Now we are showing you Nalanda in Bihar. Nalanda in Bihar contains ruins of world's oldest university. This was also a place where Buddha and Mahavira both stayed and preached. The remains of 11 monasteries and several chaityas can be seen here. We are now showing you Rajgir in Bihar. It is a sacred place for both the Buddhists and the Jains. There is Gridhakuta, where the Buddha converted a Magdhan king. We are showing you Sarnath in Uttar Pradesh. Situated 10 kilometers from Varanasi is the site where Buddha delivered his first sermon to his 5 disciples, preaching the middle path for attaining Nirvana. Realizing the sanctity of the site, Emperor Ashoka in 3rd century BC built some of the finest monuments here. We are now showing you Shravasti in Uttar Pradesh. This is another of the most commonly visited places of Buddhist pilgrimage is Shravasti. It is here that the Buddha is said to have performed great miracles of his life. Vaishali now. Vaishali in Bihar was one of the Buddha's favorite resorts, and he visited it on several occasions. It was here that he had his famous encounter with the prostitute Amrapali. According to Mahayana tradition, the famous Vimal Kirtinidesha Sutra was also preached here. Rumtek Monastery in Sikkim is also one of the very important monasteries or Dharmachakra center. It is located in eastern Sikkim, which is 24 kilometers away from Gangtok, which is the capital of Sikkim. A very interesting Sachi Stupa of Madhya Pradesh. It is a famous ancient Buddhist monument, and Emperor Ashoka built stupas in Buddha's honor at all these places in India, and this was one of the important stupas at Sachi, which are the most magnificent structures of ancient India. Ajanta and Ellora caves in Maharashtra. It's located near city of Aurangabad. Famous Ajanta Ellora caves shrines were cut off rock by hand and rank amongst some of the most outstanding specimens of ancient Indian architectural heritage. There are 34 caves at Ellora and 29 caves at Ajanta, which have been designated also as a World Heritage Site. So we end and close here. Thank you so much all of you having a great patience here.